Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Are all African Americans church-going believers? Our guest today, Anthony Pinn, says definitely not.
The Freedom From Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Welcome to Freethought Matters. Are all African Americans church-going believers? Our guest today has some answers to that question. Anthony B. Pinn is a distinguished professor of humanities and religion at Rice University. He's also the founding director of Rice's Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and professor extraordinarius at the University of South Africa. And he's the director of research for the Institute for Humanist Studies. Anthony Pinn is the prolific author of many books, including The End of God Talk, The Interplay of Things, Writing God's Obituary, which is his memoir, and the book When Colorblindness Isn't the Answer.
Anthony Pinn's newest book is called The Black Practice of Disbelief, an introduction to the principles, history, and communities of Black nonbelievers. Welcome back to Freethought Matters, Tony.
Thank you for the invitation. Delighted to be with you.
Good to see you again. So there's an assumption among many people that Black Americans are all church-going believers, but you say that's not true. How many non-religious Black Americans are there?
We don't know the exact number, but we do know a noteworthy percentage of African Americans over the past decade have been willing to say that they hold to no particular religious affiliation. And of that percentage, a good number of those folks say that they are free thinkers, atheists, humanists, skeptics. And this number is growing. So again, I can't say there are 150,000 Black nonbelievers, but the percentage of African Americans who more easily say, I don't hold to any of this, has significantly increased.
So what happens to people who leave the Black church? Do they get ostracized or shunned?
For many who leave the Black church, the assumption is by friends and family that they have surrendered not only a relationship to the divine, but they've surrendered any possibility of being moral and ethical. And for others, not being a part of the Black church also means that the status, the Blackness of this person is also in question.
Wow, so it's a real identity issue.
You were raised in religion, and could you tell us a little bit about your own personal journey?
Sure. I grew up in a church that was unaffiliated, but that was short-lived. That church eventually affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, oldest Black denomination in the country. And I entered ministry very early. Before I could stay outside after the street lights, I was opening the doors of the church, inviting people to give their lives to Christ, leading prayers. And from that, I moved into ordained ministry. So as a first-year college student, I was a deacon in this church, which meant I could marry, bury, and baptize. I gave sermons. I was one of the youth ministers. I was deep into this Black church thing.
So what happened?
Well, it became increasingly difficult for me to reconcile church thought and belief with what was taking place in the world. I felt as if I was being encouraged to answer questions folks weren't really asking and to belittle them, mock them, chastise them for asking the sorts of questions I was uncomfortable having to address. This church belief wasn't helping me to reconcile Black life with the conditions of life within our society. It wasn't making any sense. There was a profound disconnect. And it reached a point where I no longer believed most of what this church expected me to hold as true. That nothing about the conditions of life for Black people, from my vantage point, suggested that there was a God involved anywhere doing anything. It seemed it was just us moving through the world trying to make things happen. So I reached a point where I had to make a decision. Would I remain in the church, in ministry, preaching what I did not believe just because that was easy? Or would I leave and strike out and do things differently? And I decided I had to leave. There were many things I was willing to be, but I wasn't going to be a hypocrite. I could not stay in the church preaching what I didn't believe. I no longer believed in God, so the church wasn't a place for me.
So then you began your academic career.
Yes, I was always interested in the study of religion. That did not change. My personal relationship to theism changed. And so it moved from being something that I felt in terms of personal belief and intellectual curiosity to something I was interested in strictly because of intellectual curiosity. That the Black church was one institution that had shifted and changed cultural perceptions and cultural attitudes. This was a powerful force, and I needed to understand it. I needed to understand how and why theism motivated people in lots of significant ways to embrace things that worked against their own self-interest. I had to understand that. But I had more questions than I had answers, and so the classroom was the best place for me.
Well, and your many books that you've written go into greater detail about many of those questions, don't they?
Yes, there's something deeply personal about everything I write. These are questions that are heartfelt. These are questions that pull at me. And so I want to share how I wrestle with those questions with a larger audience. So there's something of me within all of these texts. I think if we're honest as writers, there's something about what we do that is deeply subjective. We can't write these books and disconnect them from who we are.
So speaking of who you are, how would you answer the people in the Black church who shun and ostracize, who think you can't be a good person or you can't even be a proper Black American unless you're going to church?
First, I'd point out the issues with that, right? That if you look at the Black church and folks who argue that you can't be moral or ethical without God, look at how Black churches have participated in the marginalization of Black people. Look at how Black churches have treated Black women. Look at how Black churches have treated the trans population. I don't think that Black churches are really in a position to tell me what constitutes proper moral and ethical behavior, not based upon how they treat people they say they love.
So you also say that the civil rights movement was bad for the Black church attendance and good for Black humanism. And to me, that seemed counterintuitive. Could you explain that?
By that, I mean that the civil rights movement pointed out several things. One, it pointed out that the Black church was not the only game in town, that the Black church was not the only organization available to get justice work done. It also pointed out how politically and socially and culturally conservative so many Black churches were. Even Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledged that Black churches didn't pay the bills, that there was folks outside of the Black church who actually funded the civil rights movement. And to assume that the Black church did all of this is to dismiss out of hand significant figures like A. Philip Randolph, who was a non-believer. Mm-hmm. But you don't have the March on Washington for Justice and Jobs without A. Philip Randolph. Think in terms of the kind of radical edge of the Black Power movement, the radical edge of Black Panthers. These were folks who had a pragmatic relationship to the Black church. They said, well, we'll deal with the Black church because there's resource and there are people. And that's the only reason. We don't abide by what they teach. We understand that that dining room hall at the Black church is a really cool space for tutoring kids. That we understand that Black churches can get information to people rather quickly, and we need to use that mechanism. But Huey Newton argued that belief in God was a lack of information. It was a marker of ignorance, and that the more we learned about ourselves, the more we learned about the world, the less we needed this concept of God.
Okay, but wasn't the church at least like a safe place to meet?
It was a safe place if you were a heterosexual Black male, but it wasn't necessarily such a safe place for Black women. And let's forget about the church's inability to deal adequately with issues of sex and sexuality. Let's think about it this way. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, again, the oldest Black church in the country, did not ordain women and have that ordination stick until the mid-20th century. This is an organization that dates back to the 19th century, but it did not ordain women until the mid-20th century.
It's still further ahead than the Southern Baptists, who formed because they were in favor of slavery.
Yeah.
So in your book, The Black Practice of Disbelief, you quote Mark D. Hatcher asking, would the civil rights movement have been necessary without Christianity? How do you answer that?
Well, it is quite clear that some of the justifications for the brutalization of people of African descent, some of the justification was provided by Christians within what becomes the United States. So yeah, there are ways in which the infrastructure of racism is sanctioned and celebrated through Christian commitment. So if Christianity had not played such a significant role within the context of the United States, it would have been much more difficult to justify and sanction the brutalization of Black populations.
So you also write that many Black nonbelievers, after they leave the church, they are welcomed into what you describe as Black humanism. What is Black humanism?
Black humanism is a philosophy of life that questions, at the very least, and more typically rejects ideas of the divine. That it is committed to science, reason, and logic, but also understands that race has been a significant element in the life of the United States. And so these are communities that without God, without any allegiance to cosmic realities, are about the business of human accountability and responsibility for shifting and shaping the world.
So can you give us a brief history of Black humanism?
Well, Black humanism is as old as the Black population within the context of the United States. So think about it this way. We cannot accurately date the spirituals. We don't know when the spirituals get underway. In the same way, we cannot accurately date the blues. Don't think 1920s race records, but the older, more secular mode of musical expression that endorsed and celebrated our physical movement through the world, that raised questions concerning what churches claimed and what churches demanded, as old as this population, and embedded within the philosophy of life within the blues are humanistic sensibilities. So very early on, cultural forms present disbelief. And then you get significant figures like Frederick Douglass. And folks say, well, no, Frederick Douglass was a believer. No, Frederick Douglass played the game. But Frederick Douglass is also the person who said he did not know the importance of prayer until he prayed with his legs.
Yes.
That is to say,
Yes.
he did something.
Right.
He was active in the world. And so you get this sort of development. It's individual figures until the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then you get folks who become affiliated with Unitarianism and arguing that there needs to be an alternative to the Black church that celebrates reason, that understands our place in the world, and moves based upon human ingenuity and human creativity and human possibility. This further develops, and within the context of the Harlem Renaissance and Black realism that follows on the heels of the Harlem Renaissance, you get figures like James Baldwin or Nella Larson, who in this fabulous novel, Quicksand, had the main character argue that she prayed and tried to get answers, tried to get something from God, only to realize there is no God, that we move through the world on our own. Or Lorraine Hansberry, who in The Raisin in the Sun has a character who says to her mother she's tired of God getting credit for what people do.
And her mother slaps her in that very dramatic scene.
In that movie,
Yes, yes.
Or James Baldwin, and folks will associate him with the church. And as a young man, yes, but he understands the limitations of the church. And so James Baldwin ultimately leaves theism. He leaves the Black church, and he argues that writing is his religion. Right? So you get these figures who are beginning to build out an alternate way of being in the world, of thinking. And it's not, though, until the 1960s, 1970s that folks like the late William R. Jones, an academic who taught at Florida State University, who wrote a wonderful book called Is God a White Racist, begins to make use of an alternate language. And that alternate language meant to capture all of this energy, capture all of the ways in which Black folks have thought themselves independent of the God idea, tries to capture all of this through the language of Black humanism. And then more recently, you get folks who say it's not enough to simply think this. We need to forge communities. We need to have ways of ritualizing life, of celebrating, of mourning that are not God-driven, but that celebrate our material existence, that are lodged in who we are and what we do as human beings.
We will talk about some of those communities.
I was going to say, amen, brother.
After we come back from the break.
Amen.
Yes.
She was not raised in the church, but she can still use that phrase. When we come back from the break, Tony, we'll talk about some of those Black humanist communities. We're talking with Professor Anthony Pinn about disbelief among Black Americans. And you will tell us more about the thriving community of Black humanists when we come back.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. There are many reasons why I'm an atheist, but I'll start with the crudest explanation. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct. And they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Rice University professor Anthony Pinn, author of many books questioning religion, including his newest book, The Black Practice of Disbelief, an introduction to the principles, history, and communities of Black nonbelievers.
What are the principles of Black humanism, Tony?
Well, there are several I try to identify. One, a suspicion concerning or rejection of the God idea, a reliance on human accountability and responsibility, an understanding that humans need to continuously correct themselves, a reliance on science and reason, and for Black humanism, a critical engagement with the Enlightenment are some of the principles that define Black humanism as I understand.
So you mean challenging some of the principles of the Enlightenment?
Well, recognizing that the Enlightenment has an underbelly, that what Blacks in the United States encounter is in part the result of the Enlightenment, right? That the Enlightenment refined and perfected a kind of racial disregard, and we live the consequences of that.
Yeah, at the same time the Enlightenment was blooming, so was slavery.
Yeah.
Real problem there.
You say that an impressive number of Black humanists are challenging Christianity for being linked to racism and capitalism and sexism. Can you elaborate more on that?
I think for a lot of Black humanists who were first affiliated with the Black church, their departure is a response to the hypocrisy of these churches, that these churches operated based upon a process of respectability politics. That is to say, they embraced the social claims and the social norms of the larger social world as a way of getting stuff and fitting in. And they did this at the expense of more marginalized African Americans. Again, think in terms of Black women, think in terms of gays and lesbians, think in terms of the trans community, that Black churches endorsed rather nasty attitudes towards these folks. And that there are ways in which the Black church endorsed an uncritical embrace of capitalism. Think in terms of the prosperity gospel, a T.D. Jakes, a Creflo Dollar, that linked the biblical text with a system of getting stuff, right? That their argument was, if you're reading the Bible correctly, if you're living in line with the will of God, you get a lot of good stuff, without any deep critique or analysis of how capitalism feeds into the perpetuation of poverty, right? No critique of the system, just a kind of widespread embrace of it. An argument that God is okay with this, God wants you to have stuff. If you don't have a lot of good stuff, you're probably not living the will of God properly.
Well, it keeps them coming
Black
back.
humanists are critical of this.
It keeps them coming back and putting donations into the church, doesn't it? That's where the money
Put their
is.
donation in rather than paying the light bill.
Right.
Because God
Right.
will take care of that.
One question I have about your book, you say that Black humanism is a religion, and a lot of us think religion has something to do with the transcendent world. How can Black humanism be a religion?
I make a distinction between religion and theism. What I am deeply critical of is theism, and that is the belief in and the reliance upon divine figures. Religion is simply a process of making life meaningful. It doesn't require God or gods, right? Carl Jung says that that religion is really the symbolic effort to wrestle with life meaning, to make life meaningful, right? It doesn't require any attention to gods or gods. It's a binding together. And so my argument is, one way to think about Black humanism is to think about it as a process of making life meaningful, right? That Black humanism becomes a way for Black folks to wrestle with the fundamental questions of human existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? And you can do that, again, without any attention to God or gods. And from my vantage point, thinking about it this way also gives us a renewed opportunity to think about the ways in which Black humanism isn't simply thought, but the way in which it's felt, right? So this gives us a way to kind of think about the ritual structures that are embedded in Black humanism.
Are there communities now of Black humanists? Who are these groups?
I think one of the more prominent groups is Black Nonbelievers out of Atlanta, Georgia. Andisa Thomas is the founder of that organization, but they have chapters outside of Georgia. Black Nonbelievers is about the business of giving Black folks who are nonbelievers a soft place to land, a community, a way to structure life, a way to wrestle with those things that are harmful, those things that constitute loss for them, but also to provide them with ways to celebrate, right? To kind of ritualize profound life moments. And from my mind, this has been one of the challenges for humanism, that humanism in larger terms is often so preoccupied with science education and separation of church and state, it forgets that we need to figure out how to be together, how to form community. How do we comfort folks who've experienced loss, right? How do we celebrate with folks who've had something really wonderful happen? That humanists haven't always been really good at that. And so Black humanism tries to correct for that by, again, offering people a soft place to land, a new community, a way of thinking about and embracing life.
You sound like a preacher, Tony.
Except I like what you're preaching.
I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Anthony Pinn.
Thank you so much.
The book is The Black Practice of Disbelief. And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because Freethought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.